welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Antoinette Weibel, it is a true pleasure to be able to have you on this podcast. I am very excited for this conversation today. We were just speaking before we hit record about the fact that I have been following the work that you and Oti have been doing over the past few years, really, on the Good Leadership Society and its broader manifestations. And I'm excited to be able to have this conversation today about meaningful work and flourishing and human resources and all sorts of probably thorny complexity that we will be getting into today. Antoinette, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm very much looking forward to. And I guess if you talk to that half of the Good Leadership Society, it's not going to be as complicated, but we'll find that out.
We'll find that out. Exactly. Maybe I can start by asking you to briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what makes your work meaningful.
Well, the obvious facts which are still important in the world out there is that I am a professor for human resource management at the University of St. Gallen, so at a business school. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I try to do what I'm doing. And what makes my work meaningful is almost a funny question, because I think I'm having such a privileged position as a researcher. So how do I spend my days? I spend my days exploring, which is very good because my core strength is curiosity. So that's a very nice one for me. Thinking, getting in dialogue, teaching young students, which I also find great, or talking also to executives in executive education. So what's not to like about that job? And I'm very knowledgeable that I'm lucky to have that type of position and to be able to do all that.
Yes, teaching is a privileged position in many ways. It does grant a lot of people an opportunity to be able to find great, meaningful work. Well, you and in Oti Vogt have been working together over the past few years on this really massive mission, which is all about fostering good leadership, good organizations, and good societies more broadly. It's a bit of an ecosystem model, which for those who might have been listening to many episodes of this podcast know I'm a big fan of those kinds of concentric models and recognizing the complexity that it's never just one silver bullet. You actually have to tackle a lot to be able to do good in this world. And I think that this is about as eudaimonic a mission as they come. I think that Aristotle would be very proud and in the front row cheering for the work that you are doing. And so I'm wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about how you got into this work in the first place.
Yeah, I've noticed that myself as well, because of course, it's huge and sometimes it's also a little bit frightening. First of all, I would say the other way around. Of course, we are sitting in the first row and cheering to Aristotle, probably also Sandel and McIntyre. So at least for me, big heroes, and I love their work and it's very inspiring. But what got me there is that when I was a PhD student, one of the articles which really stuck with me, and I think I still tell far too much or talk far too much about that article, is by Sumantha Ghoshal, where he is writing about bad management theories destroying good practice. And that, of course, already was the dismal science, as we call it, all these economic theories which were creeping into HR and everything, where we already start with a very sinister human model. So it's the economic man who doesn't like to work, who is distrustful. And by assuming that, I don't have to tell you, because you're coming from positive psychology, we're creating all these self-fulfilling prophecies. So that was something, because I'm a trained economist, which I thought very early, well, you have to change that. You cannot walk around with these theories. You have to bring better theories into the world. And then I turned early to trust research, to research on intrinsic motivation. So I did a lot on how to destroy intrinsic motivation, because sadly, that's what we are doing in organizations. But I realized at some stage that this is also not enough. I don't know how it is about you and your work, but I realized that even if I go with these insights to company and come all with all the evidence I can muster, hardly anything ever changes. And then I realized you have to probably really go even more ahead and do something what a researcher finds very difficult. Namely, I have to admit that nothing what we do is value free, but that it's all normative. And that I might want to not change, but go towards the right side of normative. And for me, that was virtue ethics, but also maybe other ideologies than the neoliberal one we are having right now. Yeah, and that is where I started to think about this, and where I then also met Otti. Because the other thing is that I realized our evidence was also not taken because it was not useful for practice. So sadly enough, what we're doing is often so removed. So I wanted to work with somebody who is coming from practice. And I think when we started, we didn't know that we would go so far, and still haven't wrote our book, although that's something which should be happening soon. But yeah, we realized, as you say, that it's much more complex, and that you really have to disentangle different levers to understand how you can bring change about.
I'm struck by this paradox of the fact that, at least within many of the human resources spaces that I surf, many people say they want evidence-based practice. That is a core to what people say they want. But then when you actually share the evidence with them, it's never satisfying. It's never helpful. It's way too complicated. Can you just tell me the silver bullet here and the one simple thing I need to do, the thing that's guaranteed to work? And of course, evidence never works in that kind of a way.
No, it never works in that kind of way. And then if it goes against something you have clung to over 30 years, it's very hard for you to accept. By the way, even for researchers. So I'm often amazed if I look at so-called evidence-based reviews, what they all leave out. And of course, that's also sometimes difficult for us. We have been growing big with a paradigm, and now we have to tear it down. I have to tell you this, I think I tell that very often. That is why I find some people like Kluger so amazing, because that guy was the feedback pole. So he was doing a very long time feedback, and then he realized that just never works. Even if we do sandwich technique or whatever, then he turned to become a listening researcher. I mean, isn't that marvelous? And now I listening is much more powerful than telling. So I just say we are all, of course, clinging to what we have grown up with, because it's very hard. Everything else, really, we then have to admit we could have been wrong, that the world could look differently. So that's not easy, isn't it?
Well, that's a good segue into the next question that I have for you, which is all about your critiques of positive psychology. So, for those again who have listened to this podcast, you know that certainly my background, my theories, my places where I have grown up are very much in this world of positive psychology and applied positive psychology in the workplace. And one of the things, Antoinette, that I am most delighted about you is that you bring your critiques all over the place, that you're prepared to walk in with critical thinking and judgment to all sorts of different spaces, including spaces that are trying to, make a positive difference, like positive psychology. And that you've done a really good job of looking at some of the ways in which positive psychology can be misapplied or misconceived in organizational contexts, specifically in what I think are as devastatingly neoliberal ways. That I heard you say at one point that a good summary of the way that positive psychology is sometimes used in organizations is to make happy cows produce more milk. And I honestly have not been able to get that image out of my head ever since I heard you say it. And I think that it is devastatingly accurate in so many ways. And so, can you just tell us more about your critique? I mean, and I know that you're coming from a place of having worked in positive HR and kind of peripheral spaces for many years. So you're coming at this from not just an external, criticism perspective, but as a way of trying to make feel better.
Well, I still love positive psychology and positive organizational scholarship, but we, as I already said, have to see where we implement it. And before I go a little bit into that, just very quickly, that is not even my own saying. And when that was used first, it was used first for humanistic psychology. So way back. And that just means if we don't change the system around, then we just, how did Karen Lecke put it? Then we're just slave to power. So that's another one. We don't want to necessarily be slave to power. But maybe very quickly, because it always sounds so easy, neoliberal paradigm. So for me, what is a neoliberal paradigm? Well, it is about a certain kind of freedom, which mainly means firms are free, but not so much the people who are working in the company. So if I would bring up a Marxist slogan, but you can also do it less extreme, you would say we are still wage slaves very much inside companies. So our freedom might be quite curtailed. It's also about what you cherish a lot in neoliberal thinking is entrepreneurial thinking and competition. So I would almost say competition rocks. And of course, that all rocks only if it pays on shareholder value. So just to give you a little bit the framing. And then, of course, all we do, so we are working on enabling better mental health, really important. We are trying to enabling thriving, high quality connections. We're going towards building trust, many more things. Is in that system, in the end, just enabling always even bigger work intensification. That's what also the figures are showing. So we are showing in the end that whatever we do helps people to cope even longer with a system which is really not conducive for human beings or human flourishing. And I think that's the problem. That's why I say it's all about happy cows give more milk, or Otti always calls it putting lipstick on a pig. That's also not much nicer, but maybe a new picture if you need another one. So
Well, great. I'm, I'm reflecting on the poor farmers who are wondering at what point do we need more sustainable farming practices here. So and maybe that's to a certain extent the point. I mean, one of the things that that is so important about the work that you and Audie are doing is that it's not just critique. You're actually trying to actively look for what the research is and to advance the study of new ways of thinking about this question of flourishing. I mean, if ultimately what we are doing in a neoliberal context is trying to figure out how do we enable productivity so that we maximize shareholder investment and create a system that produces more but squashes the conditions of flourishing. What would be a different way of thinking about that? And so one of the things that that you've been working on is this global manifesto for flourishing at work. And that's really the thing that I hope that we can dive into today, because I think in both research and practice, we spend a lot of time thinking about things like flourishing or meaningful work, but we rarely actually get into the nuts and bolts of what it can look like, how we design the conditions where we can make that happen. And frankly, your manifesto is one of the first places that I have actually ever seen a consolidated attempt to try to articulate what those design conditions can be. And specifically, I know that you're trying to tackle performance management as one of the first places that you're looking and saying, what would it look like if we actually reimagined something that doesn't undermine our eudaimonic potential, that actually fosters a greater sense of performance, sure, but also purpose and social value and flourishing at a human level.
yeah.
So I think this is wonderful. It's groundbreaking work. And I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about it and how you're trying to go about doing it.
Okay. And maybe just start with what we understand flourishing to be. So we understand it really to be able to live the good life at work, to be able to grow your human essence. Now, you can already hear it's a little bit different from how we would measure flourishing in positive psychology, because it clearly has this normative stance in it. What is a good life? But just kind of to have that a little bit in the background, because it takes us a little bit till we get there. What would that really mean? So if you are okay, and please interrupt me, because otherwise we into professorial mode again. I would kind of why performance management and what is so broken about performance management, because I think that's an important background to understand what we're doing. And here I'm also on safe grounds because I can use with evidence. So quickly, for those which are not so much around in the HR field, but maybe more from psychology, performance management is a process where we seek to align and motivate employees that they are helping an organization to have better performance. And it's usually done by targeting or goal setting, by some formal feedback during the year, by performance appraisal. And often you also have something like a carrot or a stick attached to that. So you have some consequences. And what we can say with this very classical performance management, and I think it's really harsh for me to say that, but I do have a lot of evidence here, that it is broken and it does not work for smart jobs. So it was invented for Charlie Chaplin type of jobs, but that's a very long time ago.
What do you mean? What do you mean it was invented for Charlie Chaplin jobs?
Well, it's industrialization, it's cog in the machine, it's when everything is plannable, everything is measurable, and you as a human being do not really matter. It's you're just kind of part of the machine. That's it. And for that type, yeah, it works well. I mean, even not, but it works better. Let's put it this way, because of course it's not good for health and it's not good for human development. But if we take that aside and if we just pretend we're only interested in performance, it's good.
Performance and productivity. How do you make this widget a little bit better, a little bit faster, constantly? It is a decent system for doing that.
Yeah, well, I'm having already troubles to call it a decent system, but it works, yes. But I mean, for everything else, what it does create is that we do work to rule or work to incentive nowadays. Not much better. It destroys. So if you look at performance, actually overall performance is negatively impacted because it destroys something like organizational citizenship behavior, helpfulness, creativity, everything which is truly human spark is kind of evaporated or crowded out. And it has very high costs, psychic costs, but also for organizations. And what I also have to say, well, some companies will now say, well, we don't do traditional performance management. We do agile performance management. But unfortunately, that's not much better because in my opinion, this is often just harassment, but on speed this time. So even here, I can show OKRs are not so much better than your SMART goals because they also have a number of problems. So that's just where we want to start from. It is a process which seems to be broken. HR is unhappy with it. Leaders is unhappy with it. If they would measure it properly, they would realize it's also not very good for organizational performance. But somehow it's central. Somehow it's something we want to be aligned. We want to co-create. We want to make sure that we design something which is solving problems of the world. So it's a good starting point. That's where we start.
Let me pause you right there and just add a little footnote that if you're listening to this and you're wondering what is all this evidence that Antoinette is speaking about, she has done a really great job of being able to lay that out in relatively concise videos that are available on the website leadershipsociety.world. If you go to the manifesto section, you'll be able to like scroll down and see this wealth of video content of all sorts of experts, but especially from her in terms of the way that you've actually described and cataloged some of the amazing research that talks about the failures of performance management, traditional ways of doing things. So there's really valuable stuff to be able to learn from if you are an HR professional and you're thinking about things like, oh, what do I do with all this performance management? There's very useful tools there for you. Sorry, continue.
Oh, great. And let me just use that as well. I would, especially if you want to look at the critical parts, also look at Take With It with Neil Doshi and with Tamra Chandler, because they're coming a little bit more from practice, but they're really just kind of bringing it exactly the same points, but much clearer in a more practical way also out there. So yeah, lots of stuff up there. Have a look. That would be great. But of course, from that, we are just destroying the old. That's not enough. So if we're saying performance management is still core, and I believe it is, then we have to have an understanding, how could we reform it? How could we create a context where humans can flourish, but also organizations contribute to the flourishing of all? So that was the starting point then for us. And maybe what's interesting, because we have already discussed about that a little bit, is the way we have kind of created it. First of all, we nicked it from the Agile Manifesto. So the way we build it, we try to build it in the same fashion. I mean, probably everybody who is building a manifesto is starting there. And so we also
Sorry,
have.
you were starting with the Agile Manifesto? Is that what you were saying?
Oh no, we were looking at their design principles.
At their design principles, great.
I mean, Oti was, of course, at ING, and they were poster child of agile working. So, of course, he came from that world, but they're very clever in how they design such a manifesto. And so we tried a little bit in the same way. I'm not sure whether we managed, but anyway. But what we start with are, and I think that might be worth to explain a little bit more. Other things can be also read up, but we start with 4 core principles. And these 4 core principles, they are motivated by transformational shifts we believe have to be happening. So we also we were looking at 4 shifts which we believe we need to do in order to get there. And the first shift, this is one which you have already done in positive psychology. This is from pigeon training or behaviorist to a much richer psychology. So it could be positive psychology, can also be other cognitive psychology, etc. ways. And what we here say is that you need to really have, humans are social animals, and we all have an energy to develop. And that's where you have to tap in. And so we said we would cherish growing better together much more than bonuses and forced rankings. So bonuses and forced rankings, of course, staying for everything, everybody against everybody and all on their own. So first shift is this one. The second shift is, and then we have already discussed about that, from freedom to have, which is the neoliberal way, which I also said is often just the company has freedom, but that's another issue, to freedom to be or become. So a freedom that I can really be as a human being, not as a human resource, or even become, find my potential, develop my potential. And that's a political shift, if you want to put it this way, or an ideological shift, where we kind of go from this neoliberal to a more neo-republican conceptualization, which we find much richer, because this is all about being your own master, not being subjected to arbitrary power. And if you think about that, we have a lot of arbitrary power in organizations. We have a lot of managers going wild and other things we might not want to have in that way. And here for us, it's very much that we say that will only happen if organizations stop just profit maximizing and start redefining a higher purpose and trying to bring social value also to the world. And so this is then also, we say we want a purpose and social value over profit maximizing or budget games. And now you have to again stop me because I say 2 more. Can we still take them, or do we need a break in between?
Well, I mean, I guess one of the things I just want to point out as you're describing all of this is a really fundamental ethical shift in what the role of an organization actually is, which I think is, in a very flat way, it's a total rejection of a Milton Friedman maximizing shareholder investment model of thinking about what the role of a corporation is, and kind of underpinning all of this. And you described it a little bit before as this recognition that, this is about living a good life. It's about living a good life. It's about creating businesses that create more good in the world. And that's it's a fundamentally different role for what businesses and organizations do, which is at the core of this model. You have to hold that fundamental belief before any of the rest of it's possible.
Yeah, I agree. And on the other hand, maybe it's not such a big step if we just think 30, 40 years before. I'm thinking about my favorite researcher, that's Herbert Simon, who has written a paper about organizations where he says organizations can be these wonderful machines. He uses the word machines, but it just means this is a place we created where we can really solve problems together, where we can collaborate. And it's not a market. That's an organization.
Yeah.
So already just going back there and bringing in some of the more humanistic theories we already had.
I mean,
Yeah.
let alone some of the ways of reading Adam Smith in terms of thinking about the role of kind of moral sentiment in capitalism is not there's other ways of thinking about what capitalism can be that don't just need to be in this forced competition orientation, shareholder money is the only thing that is important kind of reality.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you're right. I mean, that is really the core. And that is also, if you look at the two other shifts, so the most important one is what you were just saying. It's not all is allowed and anything is as good as the other, but it's really ethical, and ethical for us is flourishing. So it's being able to have that good life. And we say, and that would be much more important than just following what others are saying, than just hierarchy or compliance. I mean, there is some worse in that, but that's not, cannot be the core. And maybe a last one that is maybe more interesting, because that's where you are coming from, where I am coming from. We cannot just solve everything from the perspective of individuals. We really need to understand the system as well, because flourishing is emergent. Organizations really contributing to social value is also in emergent property. And so we have to understand how humans are situated in structures, in ideas, and how we bring that nicely together. So that's the last point we're making, where we say system change over individual appraisal. Maybe helpful. You have to look at the manifesto to understand what I'm talking about. But these are the four core principles and how we kind of derive them. Maybe it helps you a little bit to understand where we're coming from or going towards.
And if you're listening to this and you go to the show notes on eubd.ca/podcast for this episode, you'll be able to see that manifesto. We'll make sure that we post it and post links to all the websites that Antoinette is kind of founding all of this on. So continue, please.
Okay, and then maybe the rest, I'm not making now such a big fuss, but you really have to read it. We then have 11 principles which are more related to HR. Some of them are more overall principles where we really say you have to change your philosophy. Community is going to be really important. And what I believe is the core is to enable individual and collective reflexivity, or if I use the language of virtue ethic, it would be practical wisdom. So, I mean, I think these are really overall principles. You can understand them very well, but they're a shift in how we as HR understand our work, what we are here for, where we can contribute to. And then on the other side, we really have the core practices of performance management, but hopefully better. So, for instance, in goals, we say not OKRs are the answer. I'm just picking OKRs, could be other things as well. But learning goals, making progress, everything co-created and towards the flourishing of all. I mean, some things you know from positive psychology, but you kind of hopefully see that there is a certain nudge towards other aspects, toward this ethical aspect as well, we try to bring in. And by the way, for those who are reading this, I think you can tell that neither Otti nor myself are HR managers. And although we work with HR managers, we're very open to learn about great practices you believe belong there. So just tell us then.
It is one of the things that is very inspiring about the work that Antoinette and Otti are doing is how inclusive and co-creative this process is. And that invitation is very real in terms of working with anybody who's listening who might be interested in participating and learning and growing from the work, but even more so contributing to it and wrestling with it together. So it's very much an invitation.
Maybe a lot of wrestling, I can already tell. But that's good, because hopefully good things emerge.
Now, this might all sound very heady to many people. For me, my brain is already swirling with 4 core beliefs and 11 principles and a whole bunch of exemplary practices. And yes, it all does fit into one page, but there's a lot that's happening on that one page. For the sake of this podcast, which is all about meaningful work, we can use the manifesto to try to deconstruct some of the challenges that we've talked a lot about on this podcast in very practical ways. So a very quick refresher of where this podcast emerged. It was about really looking at the literature on meaningful work and saying there's a lot of good evidence at this point out there around the value that meaningful work has for being able to increase performance and increase motivation, and increase commitment to organizations. And a lot of people assume that that just means that it's going to increase well-being, because if everything else is going well, then surely your well-being is going to go well. And I think that the surprising thing in the literature is that is not always the case. Of course, sometimes it is, but a lot of the time, the more engaged in meaningful work that one is, especially when there's a high moral stake, when you're really trying to do work that is about advancing the good in various ways, whether that's in healthcare and education and nonprofit and in non-governmental work, in just being a zookeeper, for example, as one of our most recent episodes was talking about. The more good you ultimately try to do, the more meaning that your work has, the more obsession that one tends to find in the individual, the more that one ultimately erodes all sorts of boundaries in one's life that might keep you healthy and sane, the more that we open ourselves up to exploitation and alienation, both from outside of ourselves in terms of organizations that are supporting us, but also internally. We actually are the first ones often who are doing meaningful work to exploit ourselves, to create the conditions where we are going in expecting less pay. We are going in ultimately putting down other people who don't feel as passionately about their work. There's all sorts of these very challenging consequences that ultimately expose us to a lot of negative affect, a lot of stress, a lot of burnout, a lot of lower life satisfaction, and ultimately non-well-being, ill-being, a lot of ill-being. And so I'm curious to kind of use this manifesto as a way of trying to say, okay, there's obviously good, there's bad, and there's ugly parts of meaningful work. How can this manifesto help us make sure that we're helping people take advantage of the good, try to minimize the bad, and try to stop the ugly pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I am a big fan of the no asshole rule. So when you create a very nice place where life is a bowl of cherries, as I learned it's called in English, then you just really have to make even more sure that you keep those people out. So I think that's really important. That means screen your selection and promotion procedures, especially promotion. We're not very good in screening these out. So that's an important one. And maybe the next one, I just heard you talking about that. Never pay people less because they're intrinsically motivated. So at least living wages, but I think also for any job, make sure that you hit the market wage and give something on top. So give a trust advance. I think that's really important. So just two, I mean, I could think of more, but that's probably enough. Reduce. Here I find the 3 tests quite useful, which we stole from our interviewees. So the first test is called the eyeball test. If you realize that people are not on eyesight, then you have to change something. Often you have to change something in the system, and you have to find out why in your system you have such differences in power you don't want to have.
Can you explain that one a little bit more? Tell us a little bit more about it.
Eyeball test really means that everybody is respected in the organization. And often the way we create certain practices in organization, take for instance, performance appraisal, that is just not working, because if this, and I think almost every industrial psychologist now says that, if this is not producing truth, if it has more biases in than anything else, and we still use that, that is just for power demonstration. And here I think we have to come up with better ways. So that's not meeting the eyeball test. That has to go. That's just giving some people, like in Rome with the lions, where you can do thumbs down or thumbs up. So we don't want that. Is that plastic enough? But all in all, I think it's quite intuitive. Can you look at your structures? Can you look at the way people are having relationship in your organizations and detect places where they cannot meet eye to eye? Then you have a problem, and then you have to change it. I think that's a kind of, for me, it's an intuitive test. And the other one is, it's called tough luck test, which means we're often not the winner in some of the practices we use. Somebody might get a promotion. I'm not getting the promotion. But then you have to be sure that you designed the mechanism on where we find out whether somebody gets a promotion or not in a way that we can say, okay, that was tough luck. Next time I might get the chance. I mean, I probably can translate that a little bit into psychological language and say procedural fairness is very important. But I think that's another one. And then the last one is the fair profit test. If an organization makes profit by exploiting humans, nature, etc., then you have to take this exploitation as a minus, and then we'll see how much profit is left. So orient yourself towards the fair profit would be another one where I say it helps you to see what you have to reduce or to do differently. And if we then go on the capitalize, what to do more, then I think capitalize makes sure that humans can use their capacity for growth and development. That's really central. And create an organizational character, so structures and systems and processes, which enable co-creation and co-elevation. And I think this organizational character, this is something uniquely available in organizations. You might have that in the family as well, but an organization can do this much more systematically. So for me, that's a do, and find out how to do that better.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you think organizational character actually looks like?
Well, I mean, character is like a person's character as well. Something you can see from the outside, something that is also lived, that is consistent. You can change it over time, so you can become better or worse in your character. And in the case of organizations, what is lasting? And lasting are structures, are norms, are decision processes. And what we say if you take the picture of a character, we can say, well, this can be a good character or it can be a bad character. So create all these systems and structures in a way where you say they are enabling flourishing. I can just make it very easy. But I mean, all what we're saying, of course, in the manifesto is about creating better organizational character. So maybe I was kind of just taking a backdoor here to sneak in manifesto again.
Yeah, no, and I mean that's really useful. I mean we've had other people on this podcast speak about leadership character and character strengths, and the idea that there is certain attributes of virtue that ultimately facilitate meaning in different kinds of ways. And I think that in many organizations, at least the ways in which I have thought about character in organizations a lot of the time has been about values and about what kind of values as an organization we stand for. What are the things that we believe are really important? And I think that there's two things that often go wrong with organizations that think about values. And most organizations at this point have some set of values that have probably been handed to them by a consultant or co-created by a leadership team, maybe, or maybe one person in HR has just come up with them somewhere and they live on a computer website or maybe on a poster that sits in the lunchroom. But often those behaviors aren't translated or those values aren't translated into behavioral norms. So we don't actually know what those values actually mean. But I think even worse, those values aren't embedded into systems and processes. Those values don't wind up actually becoming part of the way that we do things like set goals or think about feedback or ultimately help people succeed through coaching or do any of the parts of performance management. And so I think one of the things that is so important about the work that you're doing is that you're trying to articulate in very concrete ways, what does it actually mean to say, hey, we care about good character in our organization, but we actually want to walk that talk. So we're going to embed it into very concrete things that we do on a day-to-day basis.
Well, that's a perfect summary, I would say. And just we're almost back to Aristotle, where it's, of course, all about this becoming. It's how you embed your virtues every day in your everyday doings, in your everyday habits. And the same should be true for organizations. And habits for organizations are not values sitting on the shelf, but of course, really norms, but also structures and processes. And so with that, completely agree.
And I mean, you said this earlier. One of the things that Aristotle talked a lot about was the the mother of all virtues is practical wisdom. It is that because of the fact that character is always contextual. So trying to figure out what the right thing to do is in this moment with these people, with this particular situation, and this particular moment in time is going to be different. Every single moment is a different moment for us to be able to think differently about how we're going to create character. And so the capacity, the virtue of being able to have enough practical wisdom to know what is needed in this moment is perhaps the most important virtue of all for Aristotle. And you mentioned that that was in some ways a core aspect of what this manifesto is, because the manifesto is complicated. Let's be honest; it's not going to be an easy thing that you can just stack on the wall and say, "Great, we're done." But I also think that there's actually a very elegant simplicity to what you're ultimately striving for, which is very much focused on practical wisdom. I don't know whether there's anything that sparks in you as I say it.
I am so glad that it transpired because we don't use the word, but I mean, this is in the end what we envisage organizations to be. I mean, you can go to something like Keegan was saying, deliberately developmental organization,
Mental.
but that's of course lacking again the ethical space. And
Mhm.
when saying no, it's collective practical wisdom, and bringing that into every nook and cranny. That's what we try to do, but that will take us another half an hour to talk about how to do that. So you're also right in your observation. It's not an easy manifesto. I still hope it sparks like in you some inspiration, because that is really a big part of it.
Mhm. I mean, I do think that this is the why. I mean, if you're wondering why you would care about sparking flourishing in an organization, it's because if we can truly invest in every single human being who is part of our organizations to have that kind of practical wisdom, to pursue with that kind of excellence, that kind of engagement, that kind of ethical perspective in the work that they're doing, there's surely no better way to not only ensure high performance, quote unquote, but much more importantly, that you're actually performing in a way that's going to to create value for everyone, to create value for society more broadly.
Yeah, that's the hope. And if you want to help us on the way, you're all welcome, because I think there is help needed.
So let's just go there. Where do you see this work going next, and where should people go if they want to learn more about this work?
Yeah, I mean, you already mentioned the web page, and I think that's our hub. That's where we put everything up. You also can link with us on LinkedIn. We have a group there. We have a page there. You can also go to Otti or to myself personally. And then we are planning quite a lot of initiatives. For instance, we want to take this manifesto further for every HR person out there, or just for somebody who's interested. Please comment, because it's an MVP. Help us collecting more good practices, and start experimenting. So we try to come up with a template so that we can later also maybe compare a little bit of this experimentation. So that is already a great way to start. And if you're really curious and you're really nerdy, we have two other things going on. One is called Leaders for Humanity, where we really talk with the big minds of our times. At present, we're talking with economists and philosophers, but that's just have a look at the videos there. You can also listen to Henry Mintzberg, who is just gorgeous and all over the place and clever in every aspect. And the other thing is Business for Humanity, where we're really trying to find out, do we have to change our economic system? Can we reinvent capitalism? Can we heal capitalism from inside? And here we're just talking with pioneers who come up with new ideas. So lots to listen to, lots to, some of them are interactive, others we really look for comments. So please just have a look.
The scale of your mission is mind boggling and so exciting and absolutely what the world needs. So thank you so much for your good work, Antoinette, and for sharing so much wisdom with us today. I am so excited to be able to see where all of this continues to go next.
I just want to give the compliment back. I find it really important also the work you are doing and bringing out the messages in the world. And I see the flow in the background when I talk to you. So I was in flow when we were talking through the podcast. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about eudaimonic by design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.